Welcome to Celtic State of Mind with me, Natasha Meikle, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Lawrence Connolly and Brian Degning in a slightly new Tuesday lineup. How are you doing today, boys?
Doing great,
Doing well.
Yeah, happy to be here. Nice sunny day, can't complain.
Yeah, not too bad, is it? So plenty to talk about in the world of Celtic as always. As you'll see on our headline, we're going to be talking today about Ange Postecoglou, our newest signing, Liam Shaw, and our boys at the Euros. We'll start with the game yesterday because we had some football being played and some of the Celtic team were involved. So we had 5, well technically 6 players in the squad yesterday, with McGregor, Turnbull, Christie, Taylor, Forrest and Jack Hendry all being involved in the Scotland squad, although we saw of course that only Christie and Henry started that game, with Forrest and McGregor coming off the bench slightly later. I'll come to you first, Lawrence. What did you make of the performances of the Celtic boys yesterday? You know, Clark is getting some praise for making some good substitutions, but was he really just correcting the mistakes he made in the starting lineup? Should Forrest have started? Should McGregor have started? What did you make of yesterday's game?
I thought the Celtic boys done okay. You know, it was very much a Celtic team performance of last season. You know, 19 shots on targets, no goals. It's, you know, what was Marshall doing off his line? Who knows? But maybe a wee bit cautious from Clark. Would have liked to have seen Forrest on earlier. He's certainly, if we're looking for a big game player with experience, he's it, isn't he?
Brian, I'll come to you. So I think we are having some slight sound quality issues, so we will try and get that sorted as we go along. But Brian, I'll come to you. Should Forrest have been on from the start? I mean, McGregor's one we've talked about having played so many games this season, and then we get to this important game and he's not started. Would you have had him in the starting lineup?
Yeah, I thought I would have had him in the starting lineup. I've got to say, I went from the highs of highs to the lows of lows yesterday. I'm sure a lot of us did. I'm just about over it. So last night I was complaining about the lineup, selection, stuff like that. But to be honest, on reflection, I feel like they played fairly well. If I'm honest, I don't want to sound like Neil Lennon who's been talking about it today, but I actually think that if we take any of the chances we created, we comfortably win, I think. They scored an absolute wonder goal, to be fair. And if you lose a game, you lose to that. But yeah, Forrest should have started over O'Donnell. Did I think Armstrong starting was the right call? Yeah. Did I think Christie starting was the right call? Probably not for me, but I did think he played well. You can see, regardless of what formation would have started or what personnel would have started, you could shoot apart all day. The reality is, if Dykes can't put the ball in the net, and Andy Robbo, Liverpool captain, can't quite nail a shot from an open goal almost, you've got to say that's not really down to selection, that's down to the players. So I'm upset, you know, kind of gutted about it, but I just feel like I can't really blame Stevie Clark too much, to be honest.
Yeah, it was disappointing, wasn't it? I think it was one that if we really did want to go and do anything in the Euros and get something out of this group, then I think yesterday was one that we had to take points from. And like you say, you know what, it was there. It was definitely a possibility. They were there. I don't want to say they were there for the taking, but there were certainly chances that we could have scored to get something from that game. And you felt, I don't know, when that shot went over Marshall, you felt like it was going to be one of those days that it wasn't going to come off for you, and unfortunately it didn't. We'll touch on David Marshall, because obviously goalkeepers is something that we've discussed regularly here at ACSOM, in particular looking at Barkas. Now, at the time we signed Barkas, there's a lot of talk about David Marshall coming back. And up until last night, David Marshall has been getting plenty of plaudits for being an excellent goalkeeper. Last night he got a bit criticised for being so far off his line. At first I watched it and I thought, why on earth is he in that position? But to give David some credit, maybe that is where he was told to stand, and Andrew Robertson has come out and defended his positioning and said that was what the team wanted. They wanted to be playing that high and they wanted their goalkeeper in that position. So I think it's a bit harsh on Marshall to then turn around and say that he was on the wrong position when that was where he was meant to be. Would we have taken Marshall over Barkas at the start of this season? Lawrence, what do you think?
Not for me, but listen, if that's where Marshall was told to stand, apparently that's the way Postecoglou likes to play as well, so we might see a few more goals like that. The Czech boys team, it's cracking, it's 50 odd yards, he's done it really well, but it's a poor goal to lose, isn't it? We had enough chances to win. I know it sounds like Lenny, but 19 shots on target, I think it's just lacking quality up front, and I think James Forrest, if he'd been on for the start, would have made a difference.
I think Natasha's froze there. Just while she's getting our sort of feedback prepared, we should probably talk about, if we're talking about players, we should probably look at some of the players that are linked with Celtic just now. We're talking about the Postecoglou rebuild. What have you made of some of the guys we're linked with so far, Lawrence? Has anything impressed you so far?
Well, I tell you what kind of worries me, who's making the decisions? Like Paddy's went, right? Klimala, really hard working forward, closes people down. That kind of fits Postecoglou's game plan. So who's making the decisions for him to go? We're told we've been speaking to Postecoglou for a long time. Well, did he have any involvement in that decision? Because Ajeti doesn't seem like the kind of pressing forward. So you're thinking, well, if we have been speaking to Postecoglou for a long time, we've just let a player that fits his style of game go. A young player that, he's got a reputation for developing young players. So you're thinking, who let him go? So who's making the signings is the worrying thing. The boys for Japan, no doubt Celtic have an eye on the money. I know Nakamura, when he signed, there was loads of Japanese media come over and generated a lot of cash and merchandising for us. So, the boys get a good scoring record at Yokohama. Be interesting to see him come in. Obviously, Postecoglou knows him and he fits his style. There's no doubt we're short up top. Centre half, I see there was talk of the Czech centre half coming in. About used to be at Chelsea. I think he played in that game where Stevie G had the slip. So we're going to need somebody commanding at the back, and he seemed to do okay yesterday against Scotland. So yeah, so some of them look okay, but you're wondering who's making the decisions and
I think
what the overall plan is.
I think that's the big concern, is the decisions. I think that the Japanese guy, and I don't want to murder his name here, but I think it's Edu Onwayu. He scored a lot of goals in the Japanese league, but the reason I think he's quite good to be linked with is the fact that Postecoglou comes in, he's going to have to try. One of the big concerns I've got with him is the amount of time it's going to take to get the team playing the way he wants to play. If he can bring a couple of guys in that already know how he wants to play, in theory, that should limit the amount of time he needs to adjust his squad, surely. Natasha, we were just chatting about some of the signings coming in for the rebuild, and we'd mentioned the Japanese lad up front, and I think we've been linked with Matty Ryan as well. What do you think about some of these guys coming in?
Oh, I think Natasha might be frozen there.
She's frozen there. I'm sure she's just paying a lot of attention or she's frozen. But again, like guys like Matty Ryan, the Japanese guy Edu Onwayu coming in, I think if these help the transition for Postecoglou coming in and rebuilding, it's surely all the better, because it makes it easier for that squad to adjust to his methods. If your strikers bang them in right away, the rest of the squads can surely adjust quicker.
You would think so. Matty Ryan's going to be in a big wage though, isn't he? It's the worry there. You've already got Barkas on a fairly decent wage, so I know Postecoglou knows him, and Postecoglou wasn't short in encouraging Tom Rogic to kind of play every Australian international. So are we going to be facing that situation if we bring in an Australian keeper, where the current Australian boss is saying, "Oh, come back, play the games"? But who knows? It'll be interesting to see.
Are you back, Natasha? Still a few issues there. I think you're right, Lawrence, but one of the interesting things about the rebuild is so many players have to go. So you're looking at, we spoke about it the other day, so we won't go over it again, but do you think it's a case that we're going to have to, and we don't know who's making the decisions, but is it a case that they have to get...
I think so. We're having some technical issues at my end, so apologies for that. I don't know if
Natasha,
No, you've gone again, Natasha. Listen, it is a huge rebuild. I know we've touched on it, but I suppose sometimes when you look back at Rodgers, he handed out a lot of big contracts. You've got, Rodgers and fairly big money. We still don't know the full effects in COVID. What kind of money we're going to have as a club. So it is a huge rebuilding job, and part of that is going to be clearing out. And I think that started kind of December last year. El Hammond went away, he's in big money. There's rumours that Beaton wants to go. Who else is left in big money? Julian, Forrest, McGregor, Barkas, Griffiths, if we keep him, what's he on, 15k a week? So it's roughly $750,000 to keep him for another year. And when we're short up front, you're kind of going, well, what would that $750,000 get us? If we let him go and we spend $750,000, are we going to get that quality up front? And I know it's a few seasons since he's really hit it, but Leeds gets problems. We don't know how much of that's down to them. We don't know how much maybe a new coach could get him back on board. Who knows? And maybe missing out on the Euros is maybe spur Lee on, because that was his chance, wasn't it? Last chance major championship, and it's gone, and he's maybe looking at himself and thinking, what could I have done to be playing in those games?
I'm I've said this before, I'm on the Griff train. I think that it's a no-brainer to have him back in the squad, especially when you look at the lack of depth. Going back to the Euros there, one of the things that's been terrifying me, and I think they touched on it yesterday, is David Turnbull being linked to Aston Villa. And one of the fears I've got is if you look at the players, and I know he never started against the Czechs, but you think guys like McGregor, Forrest, if they play well, they're going to get offered moves, because surely, I know we're talking about David Turnbull, if he has a good tournament, he's going to be on people's radar anyway. And we're talking about Christie being in the shop window, but surely if we need to be considering guys like Kalmack, guys like James Forrest as well, because if you lose guys like that, along with the Deadwood, the rebuild always becomes impossible, surely.
I think Forrest is a Celtic for life. I think he's decided that's it. He's had chances down south. Kalmack, I'm more worried about 27, 28. He's maybe looking and thinking this is the time to move. He's one of the players on big money. We know Brendan Rodgers is a big fan of him. When was the last time Kalmack had a really good season? Not last season anyway. I would probably say not the season before it. He's definitely kind of regressed since Rodgers has left. Whether that, there was a couple of times last season, he said in his after-match interviews, we didn't know what I might be doing out there. We didn't know what the plan was. Maybe he's a player that, certainly needed more information than Lenny was giving him. That was apparent. How much information or how he would respond to Postecoglou, who knows? But if Leicester were to test the waters with a £20-25 million bid for Kalmack, I think Celtic would jump at it.
I think they have to at this stage. I think that you look at the financial situation Celtic going to be in, as well as everybody else. I think that they're going to have to get any revenue you can. Now, we don't know what the numbers for season tickets yet, as far as I know. But you've got to assume they've took a hit as well. Not only because of the way fans have been treated, but just people's financial situation is surely going to be hit. So there is a concern there as well. Just before Natasha comes back and we get back to the agenda, you mentioned Neil Lennon. I don't know if you saw his comments. He did an interview with the Record, I think, where he was doing some interview after the Euros, and he was talking about the squad. And he mentioned that there was players disaffected because they wanted to leave.
Yep.
And there was a tense atmosphere in the squad, and that basically made the season very difficult. Now, that's everyone of us knew that from the start. I mean, when he went through them all under the bus, you knew that was a problem.
Yep.
He claims there was only one bid for one player, and it wasn't good enough. I don't believe that for a second. In my opinion, if you're a strong manager, if that was my squad and half of them wanted to go, you could find them a buyer.
Oh.
You could say the agent's time to let them go. So surely that's still down to him as opposed to blaming the players again.
Well, bid's different from, if someone wants to buy you, they don't necessarily bid. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the background before a firm bid comes in. And I don't think Lenny handled the transfers. I'm assuming it was Peter that handled the transfers. If he said no one's for sale, we're not encouraging any bids, we don't really want any bids. Maybe the clubs went, well, we would have bid, but it wasn't for sale. And their agents and the players would know that there was teams interested in him. But it's interesting, kind of obviously, I think we touched on it at the weekend, but obviously Lenny's saying, the fans were obsessed with 10 in a row. Well, it was the board that changed the recruitment and the transfer strategy because of 10 in a row. They didn't sell players that would normally have sold. You're either signing a contract or an extension of your contract when you've got 2 years left, or we're going to try and find a buyer for you. We're going to try and maximise you. They decided to change the way they done things for 10 in a row, and it didn't work. They kept players who became disaffected, whose values dropped drastically because there was only 12 months left. I mean, the only transfer you could maybe say was a success was Turnbull. And the funny thing is, Turnbull wasn't last year's transfer policy, it was the year before. He just joined a year late because of injury. So how much have we lost in the value of Edward, Aya, well, Cham? We know it's 14 million euros for Porto. So you've lost about 10 million quid on that boy. you be keeping him for the 10. So, there was talk, Eddie, of 40 million, now there's talk of 12, 15. I could say, conservatively, they've probably lost 30 million on that transfer strategy, forcing players to stay, letting them run their contracts down. I mean, what would we get for Christie, even if he's a good Euros? I don't think we're going to get any more than 4 or 5 million for him, and I think we'd be really lucky to get that.
I agree, Lawrence, and the thing with Christie in particular is we hear conflicting rumours, but apparently he's only got 6 months left in his deal. And then, people might just hang out, might just get him in January, sign a big contract, and then he can sit, and then what happens to the atmosphere in the squad is the problem. And this is where my issue is. On the subject of transfers, one of the things that obviously we spoke about earlier was who's making these deals, who's making these decisions and stuff. And at the moment, a lot of signings are conjecture. We've kind of spoke about who we think may come in. But one guy that has come in is Liam Shaw. Now, I'm wondering, first of all, before we think about how he'll do, what he'll contribute, who do you think it was that brought him in? Was he identified before? Was it a Nick Hammond signing? Is this someone that has been flagged up? What's your take on it?
So, I think it's something that's been identified before. I think that the club probably runs, or should be running, two recruitment strategy. They should have a recruitment strategy that identify good young players that they're interested in, regardless of when a manager changes or not. Because let's be honest, when Brendan left and taking everyone with him, it's not a situation any clubs want to be left in again, starting from scratch. So obviously Celtic's got to try and avoid that by having almost a business as usual if the manager moves. But there's got to be a ceiling on how much they're going to spend on players or how much they're going to commit in wages at that level. You wouldn't want, somebody sanctioning or not sanctioning somebody like Ivan Toney that's really nothing to do with football. That's the CEO going, we don't want him, it's an extra couple of 100,000, or we don't want McGinn for the extra 500,000. That should be, the top end transfers, I think, should be left to the football guys rather than your CEO. So I think Celtic probably run kind of two transfer strategies. One, they've got to have a recruitment strategy where they've got files and people looking up and coming young players that they might be able to pick and turn quickly. And that'll run regardless of waiting for a manager to come in or not, if they think, the risk is really small there.
That's kind of my concern. I agree with you. I think that's actually what's going to happen. But if we're looking at that and that's the case, then that surely means everyone we've got on our transfer list is a Nicky Hammond find. That means it's basically, we've complained about the standard transfers for a couple of years. Are we running off that same sort of shortlist that we had for last year or the year before? The worry is that we're going to get these guys in a game that actually, it's the same sort of standard we've had before it. Maybe these young guys that are a project, but maybe don't get a game or don't play as much. And I think that's the real worry, because Postecoglou may have some guys we've mentioned that he knows that play in Europe, that play around about, that can come and join. But it seems like a mishmash of past signings we thought we might have identified a couple of years ago or a year ago, and guys he may or may not know. It doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence for the transfer strategy.
Well, I suppose in transfers, they don't make the signings, whoever's targeting it. So you can maybe flip it and go, well, whoever was identifying people identified John McGinn and Ivan Toney. Would they make an improvement to the Celtic team if we'd spent the extra million that those two would have cost? Undoubtedly. What would it cost to sign the pair of them just now? So at some point, I think Brendan Rodgers talked about this, Lenny's talked about it, you need to get your first choice targets. So good enough targets were being identified, but we had some kind of problem of landing our first choice targets. I mean, get back to last season, Lenny wanted Foster, he wanted Omar Colley, and he wanted Ivan Toney. So we didn't get any of those three. He also asked for two wingers on loan because he knew we were short. Forrest and Johnson get injured with no wingers. you know, so, you know, Toney and McGinn, somebody identified them as players of the right quality, but Celtic were unable to complete the deals. And we've had the last two managers talking about that. We're unable to land our first choice signing targets. And surely with enough money to pay an extra $500,000 each for those boys. You know, it's not a huge risk when you think, what was Bio? 2 million, what was Shred? 1.5 or something? You know, so it's, the money's there that somebody's willing to spend. I mean, Shred, the manager, didn't even know about, you know, at the time it was signed. So somebody's willing to gamble $1.5 million without involvement of the football manager, but they're not willing to push out an extra $1 million with the involvement of the football manager, by him saying, look, these are my first choice targets. There's something wrong about the way that functions.
And one of the hopes, I suppose, in a more positive way, is that that's going to change. Obviously, change of CEO, hopefully coming in. One other player I want to talk about, just before we move on to the squad that we've got, about potentially coming in is it Charlie White? Is that how you say his name?
Aye, the boy from Sunderland. So
I'm just interested what your take on him is. So when I heard about it, I was very underwhelmed. If I'm honest, I felt like 28-year-old from League One. And I saw his stats from last year, 26 goals, 3 assists in 40-odd games. Brilliant return. My slight concern is the previous year, in 27 games, there was 5 goals and 1 assist. The year before that, in 27 games, there was 4 goals and 3 assists. So I'm wondering, are we just getting excited because we've seen that this guy may be available very cheap and he scored a few goals last year? Or is there something changing his game? I don't know enough about the guy. What's your take on it?
Listen, last year, you're looking going, brilliant return. And as you've touched on before, he's never really done it before. League One is kind of what we can afford. You know, but we decided we couldn't afford Tony, but is it a Postecoglou signing? I mean, that's my main worry. Who's really making this? How involved is the manager in these signings? How are they going to tie in to what the manager's game plan is or ethos is for the club and the way they play football? And it's all a bit unclear just now. You know, we're talking about, you know, the structure's going to be a director of football. Well, we don't know if Celtic are still looking at that or not. You know, it's kind of, we're a bit in the dark, really. So with him, he looks like a cheap option to me. He doesn't have a brilliant track record. Last season was good for him. But the real worry is, who's making decisions? How involved is the manager? You know, if all we've done is change the manager and we're not changing the structure of the club or how we manage the recruitment and bringing people into the football side, it doesn't augur well for the future, I don't think.
Right, we've got Natasha back here. Good to see you again, Natasha.
We are going to give this one more try. If the Wi-Fi gives up on me or if the sound quality gives up on me, then I'm leaving you both to it. But for now, we're going to give it one more try. So it sounds like I've come in at an interesting point. Can you just recap what you've been talking about and what's up in there?
Yeah, so we've been discussing some of the potential transfers coming in, discussing who may or may not be making the decisions. What I was going to go on to next, if you're up for it, was talking more positively about, you know, what we're going to be looking for when Postecoglou comes in, who can we develop in the squad, and maybe is there going to be a few surprises there. So general transfers, and then we're going to move on to who we think may benefit from Postecoglou coming in.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting for me is that he seems to be quite good on this youth development sort of angle. It's one thing I've not heard talked about very much when talked about Postecoglou, but having spoken to some friends in Australia, obviously Postecoglou started with the Australian youth teams and did a very good job with them before progressing to the first team. And one of the things that he has done is help progress some of those young Australian players onto European leagues and into the Australian first team. So that's, you know, quite an interesting angle because it's something that Celtic are going to need to rely on going forward, because I think youth development is going to become a much bigger part, and I hope it becomes a much bigger part of our model. The way I see the Celtic model going forward is sort of, 3 strands. I see us having the youth system, especially with the Colts team that we know are going to come into effect for this season. I see us hopefully being able to establish a lot more players from that Colts team to move into the first team. I think it's something that's been lacking in recent years, and I hope the Colts system, along with Postecoglou himself, are going to be good for developing the youth players into the first team. So, that's one strand I see are sort of moving forward. And the second one is looking around our own league, looking at the better players in Scotland from the other teams, and almost, cherry picking the best players from the rest of the league. Combining that with, maybe if it ends up having to be loan deals or, better European players on these 2 or 3 year deals that we develop and then send on in a similar way we've done with Ayer and Edward, or the loan signings of El Yunusi. If we supplement our 2 first strands with this as a third strand, I think that's going to be the model we see going forward. And in terms of that final strand, the sort of European side players, what Postecoglou could bring is actually a whole new market. He knows the J League, the A League. Are there any sort of, undiscovered gems there that he's able to pull out of those leagues, develop for a couple of years at Celtic? So I think it's quite interesting. I think it's quite exciting to see what Postecoglou does with this. But in terms of players from Scotland, I'll be very interested to see who he goes for. Obviously, with the Australian connection, Martin Boyle's heavily linked, and we've heard Nisbet being linked a lot more regularly in recent weeks. But Lawrence, I'll come to you. What do you think? How do you think those sort of 3 strands are going to work? And if you are looking at the better players in Scotland, which would be the ones that you would be taking?
I'd grab Nisbet in a heartbeat. Let's be honest. His work rate's phenomenal on the pitch. He's also a footballer. He's got the talent. Looking at the Scotland team, you can see Dykes has got work rate. Is maybe lacking in talent. If those chances had fell to Nisbet, I think we'd had at least 1 goal. So, yeah, I think we've got to look round about Scotland to see who's well. Lewis Ferguson, I think he's done well. Alan Campbell, maybe in Motherwell, he's a good chance. Players that we've got in our youth, surely Lee O'Connor, Luke O'Connell, Scott Robertson, Dembele. I know he's only got a year left, but these are guys that you'd really want to see coming on. And young Henderson, whether he's going to make it or not as well. But, when Robertson came in, I thought he'd done really well for Celtic. He's went out on loan, and surely that's improved his game, getting game time. I think those are the guys that we're kind of looking for Ange to step up and do something with, isn't it? The loan signings, we've used it well. We've used the Man City connection well in the past.
Absolutely.
And hopefully we continue to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For me, I wonder to what extent these players that we're mentioning are going to go to the Colts team. How much can we pull out of those young players and take them into the first team when we know that we need to field the Colts team next season as well. So it'll be interesting to see what he does with that. Are any of them going to be first team, or are they all going to be left in the Colts team for their development there? And how often, can we take a player and say, right, you're first team to the detriment of the Colts team? So I wonder what the relationship with that team will look like.
Well, it's something we've touched on before. We're not sure how it'll work. Once they've played for the Colts, can they then step in the next week to the first team or not? Would that tie them, say, until the winter break, until the transfer window opens again, then they come in part of your first squad? Don't really know how the Colts is going to work. I don't think the information's out there. That was the good thing about the old reserve league. They could get bled in to the first team, 2 or 3 games, even if it's just off the bench, then back in the reserves for a while, and you had that flexibility. Hopefully, the Colts is going to give you the same. Because for me, the Colts isn't about winning the league, it's about developing the players. So if it's to the detriment of the Colts team, they drop points, who really cares? If the players are improving and you're pulling out players because they're going to help the first team, brilliant.
Yeah, Brian, what do you think on that? How do you see the Colts relationship working with the first team?
Well, I'm hoping that, like Lauren said, we can develop a few players. Just going back to the players we listed for the Scottish League, Nisbet, Campbell, etc. Some of the better players are guys like Campbell, Ferguson, McCann. They're all midfielders, and it's an area where we probably don't need that much strengthening. So the talent pool I think we're looking for is centre halves, full back, striker. And other than Nesbitt, I'm not sure there's loads of centre halves, full backs, maybe apart from Doidge at Hibs, that we can actually fish for the Scottish market. I say the better players in Scotland seem to be, for me, sort of midfielders and stuff. I don't think there's any centre backs in the SPFL. I would take it Celtic just now, if I was being honest. The boy Porteous is always linked, but I don't know. I don't think the big boy's got it, if I'm honest. And as I say, guys like Campbell, Alan McCann, stuff like that. But then, are they going to be that much better than a Scott Robertson, a Luke O'Connell, if they're played in the team? I'm not sure. One of the good things about the boy Liam Shaw coming in is I think what he will hopefully give is a physical presence, because that's what you're really lacking in the team just now. We need a couple of big ugly centre halves and a couple of sort of big powerful midfielders, and that's where a lot would always go to Scotland first. I still think we're going to have to cast our net wider.
This will be interesting to see what's the effects on COVID down south and across Europe.
I want to bring up this comment from Clancy1888, who's watching on YouTube, who says that we need a replacement for Scott Brown. Coming back to this comment saying that we need a replacement for Scott Brown, that's got to be Postecoglou's priority, and Callum McGregor is not the new captain. Lawrence, what do you think about that? Is Callum McGregor the new captain? Do we need a replacement for Brown? Does Postecoglou need to bring in his own captain? What do you think?
Listen, I don't think you should be looking for a replacement for Scott Brown saying, right, we've got to replace Scott Brown. We need to, a defensive midfielder. Who that's going to be? Can Sorrow step up? Could Calmac play that position? They're going to play it differently from Scott Brown. So, can Callum be the captain? I think there's a real dearth of leaders across the first team squad. Not that long ago, you'd be going Brown, Hayes, Tierney, Lustig. There was a number of guys, Moussa Dembele, you would be going, those are proper leaders. Just now in the squad, who would you say was a leader? And it's something I think the team suffered from kind of last season, that there is no one that's kind of picking the team up and driving them on. And if we do go for a centre half or any big money signings, we've got to be signing leaders.
Absolutely something I agree with. And some of the players you've touched on there, they aren't the best players in the world. They weren't the best players in the league, but we got rid of far too many of them at the same time. You're talking about players like Craig Gordon and Johnny Hayes and Simonovic and Lustig. Were they the best players at the time? They weren't. They weren't top quality players, but what they did bring was that leadership and that experience that I feel we really lacked in the squad this season. So it'll be interesting to see the sort of player we bring in under Postecoglou. Something I wanted to move on to was Neil Lennon's comments. Has anybody obviously had the chance to listen to them today? Neil Lennon goes back to talk about the Dubai trip. So what he is saying again isn't an apology. He has again come out and defended this trip to Dubai. And I was surprised to hear him do that. I was surprised that it's reared its head again and again. He is complaining about lack of fairness. And it's very similar to the press conference he gave straight after Dubai. It was the same sort of things he was saying. His delivery was a lot different. I think what he lost in terms of content was at the first saying was as a result of the delivery he gave after that Dubai trip. But a lot of the points remain valid. For me, if it really was the case that the rules changed while Celtic were in Dubai, and as a result, we were caught out by that, we had to have a lot more players isolating. If those rules changed, I would want the club to be asking serious questions about that. But I think what Lennon missed today when, he was saying these things was that for the fans, it isn't really about whether the trip was pre-approved. It isn't about whether we had the government permission to go on it. It was the fact that we chose to do that at that time of the pandemic. What Lennon's done today is he's compared it to the Scotland training camp. And I just don't feel that you can do that. For me, we're in a completely different scenario. It's completely different circumstances. And it still remains that decision to go to Dubai was a mistake. And we were the only club in Europe who decided that they needed a warm weather training camp like that. And again, he's come out and defended it rather than saying, we got this one wrong. Lawrence, I'll come to you on this because it is something that I know that you've been speaking to me about a bit off air. in the terms of the comparisons with the Scotland camp. And what's your thinking on this one?
Look, listen, we know the media's not going to criticise the Scotland team like they criticised Celtic. You know, both of them have went to a country that's pre-approved trips, so you could say it's similar. Then, but things have changed. You know, Portugal is no longer safe. Miraculously, Scotland had no close contacts with their one COVID test. I know they've had close contacts before because Celtic have suffered from it, but not Arsenal. So, you know, obviously Scotland's learnt how not to have close contacts. And the rules changing. Apparently it wasn't while we were in Dubai. Apparently it's when we get back. Apparently Celtic handed in the list and it was meant to be 3 close contacts. The Scottish Government got involved, didn't leave it to the Joint Football Response Group, and come back and said, oh no, it's 13. So if they have changed the rules retrospectively, the club should be making a lot more of it. And why is it being left to the manager, or now former manager, to speak out about it? You know, it is worrying if that's the way the government's kind of behaving. You know, they let one club investigate themselves. You know, they were pretty quick to suspend 2 of our games. You know, there was no law breaking as such. There's other clubs whose players have broke the law who get to investigate themselves. Also get government loans, you know, a few million quid for the government, there you go, not a problem. So it's kind of a worrying situation. You're wondering who's standing up for Celtic here. I don't think John Reid would have let it happen. I don't think Fergus McCann would have let it happen without comment. And maybe Celtic are making comment behind closed doors. It's once Lenny's kind of brought that out in the open, Scottish Government still haven't denied it. But more worryingly, no one from the Celtic board has stepped up and done anything about it that we can see. So it's out there in the open just now, and it only appears to be Neil Lennon pushing it. Celtic don't seem to be saying no, the rules didn't change. Scottish Government haven't said no, the rules didn't change. What, is it okay for us to be treated differently then? Is that how the board's going to accept it? And there's no way Fergus would have accepted it, and there's no way John Reid would have accepted it. And it's ridiculous if it's happened.
Brian, I'll pull you in on that one. What were your thoughts on Neil Lennon's comments this morning that we've come back round to talking about this? I know we've talked about it a lot on this show, but again, it's another Celtic story that's reared its head this morning by the fact that Neil Lennon's back in the press talking about it. What did you make of his comments today?
I felt that, so the interesting thing about it is, so I don't think there was any doubt that the treatment Celtic and some other clubs received were different. The issue is why were the rules different for one and not for the other? And that's something that you're unlikely to ever find out, but it's a question that needs asked. The fact that none for the board, as Lawrence has touched on, has bothered asking, either means they've asked privately and got what they think is a satisfactory response, or they just don't feel it's worth it. Going back to Neil Lennon saying it, and maybe I'm being cynical, maybe I'm a bit biased against it, but I just feel like he's saying it to defend himself again. I feel like everything he's done since he's left Celtic has been about self-preservation. You know, the capitulation wasn't my fault because the fans were assessed for the 10. You know, Dubai wasn't my fault because we were allowed to go. This wasn't my fault, that wasn't my fault. I don't think he's doing it to defend Celtic as a club. I think he's doing it to defend Neil Lennon as a man. And I can kind of understand that, but I think this strategy he has, Lawrence and I sort of touched on it briefly earlier, where he was like, one of the other comments he made recently was about how the players were detached and there was a tense situation at the club. And one of the other things, when he was asked about Postecoglou coming in, he said, and it's a direct quote, he said, well, if I was a Celtic fan, I wouldn't be worried. Now, I don't know if that was a slip of the tongue or not, but it seems to me that Mr. Celtic, the bash kissing, Rangers fighting, trophy winning, Northern Irish warrior, wouldn't be sitting there saying, if I was a Celtic fan. He'd be defending the club. He'd be saying, I'm delighted to see Postecoglou coming in. I think we're going to be good for it. Not the fans are being sceptical. He'd be saying, yep, we got Dubai wrong, but it's not the club's fault. We've done everything right. Yeah, in hindsight, it's a mistake, but we were treated differently. Celtic shouldn't be treated differently. That's what he'd be saying, but he's not. He's saying it wasn't my fault. And that, for me, it's just, I feel like he's almost intentionally trying to separate himself from everything Celtic related to get a new job. And that, for me, is kind of hurtful, to be honest, because the fans, as much as he's given a lot to Celtic, the fans have given him a lot over the years, a lot of support, a lot of love, and a lot of patience. And even up until he lost his job last season, there were still people fighting amongst themselves defending him. And yet it seems to me he's quick to throw Celtic under the bus. And again, the long-winded answer to your question is, I think he brought up Dubai again to separate himself from that and defend his decision to go, not defend the club's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to agree with you, Brian. It's a shame because everything Neil Lennon is doing at the moment is damaging his relationship with the fans. And something we've spoken about before is that you can almost separate his legacy and his current relationship with the fans. His legacy as a player and as a manager first time round has unfortunately been tarnished with the last season. There's no getting away from that. I think, maybe in time, history will look back on it and we'll be able to appreciate in some way what he did for the club as a player and to an extent as a manager. But what he's doing now is really damaging the relationship with the club and with the fans by coming out and saying some of the things that he is. And it's hard to see because, we all supported Neil Lennon like you've touched on, Brian, but I wanted to bring that up and discuss it today, but I know that we do have to look forward and talk about Ange Postecoglou because he is our manager now.
The worrying thing is Neil Lennon's actually paying a PR company to come up with this strategy. Exactly what he's trying to achieve here. What's the goals of this the PR company? You're kind of going, this is like a train wreck. Some of the stuff he's going out with, and you're just going, but you're paying somebody for this?
It sounds like he's hired the Celtic PR company to deal with it, such as
it does, doesn't it? Yeah. It could be. But yeah, no, it's actually, it's Natasha said, listen, we move on. We've got Ange coming in, and we want, I think everybody wants to see the board backing him. Getting some of the money to spend, we've still got the Frimpong money. It looks like Eddie and Ayer will bring decent money. We've touched on, we could get big for McGregor. We could easily bring in 30, 40 million pounds. How much of that will be given to Ange to spend and reinvest in the squad? Because let's be honest, there's a lot of positions where we need starters for.
Mm-hmm. It's a big pot we could have there, but it's a big rebuild that we need to do. I mean, you're looking at the number of players that we've got going out the door. Equally, that's a certain number of players we need to look at coming in the door. But as you've touched on, Lawrence, if we have that money coming in for Edward and Ayer, maybe Christie, that's enough to surely fund the sort of core of a rebuild. It's the timing, though, isn't it? It's the timing and how long we've got to do this before the Champions League qualifiers. They are just round the corner, as we keep saying, and that gets closer and closer every day. And today we also got, the fixtures out, so we know where we will be at the start of next season. Obviously starting away to Hearts on Saturday, July 31st, and 8 o'clock kickoff. That's not far away, is it, Brian?
No, it's certainly not. And one of the things, I'm really excited about Postecoglou coming in, first of all, and I want to make that clear. I'm not naive to think it's going to be. I've said before, I think this season's a transitional season. I don't think everything that we need to get done will get done this season, and that includes, we could win the league, of course, but I think it might take him more time. And time's the key thing, isn't it? As you say, Natasha, because we're weeks away from kicking off against Hearts, newly promoted Hearts on Saturday night, with a squad of players that I don't think they've actually met the manager yet, have they? He's still a couple of days away from even starting. So that's a real worry, given the fact as well that from what I've seen about him, he seems to need the time. There's a really good thing I saw that Jim Orr showed, and it was a talk Postecoglou was doing, a kind of leadership talk, and one of the key things he talked about was never bowing to pressure, taking as much time as he needs, and basically ignoring everything else. And I tell you what, the big fella looks, he looks like he can talk a good game, but he will need all of that Australian grit if he goes to Tynecastle at 8 o'clock on Saturday night and Beaton gets torn in knots at the back and we don't go off to an absolute flyer. So I'm very excited, I'm very positive about him, but I think it could be a tough couple of weeks.
I think that he is the sort of character who is going to take this in his stride. From everything I've read about him, from the videos I've watched, from understanding from people who have followed his career, what he is like as a person, this is something that he will take in his stride, because you do have to be a strong character really to come into this job and come into it in the circumstances. Celtic have made it quite clear with the statement about Howe that Howe was first choice, and Postecoglou will know that, and that must be difficult to overcome as a manager. But I think it's a sort of character he is, that he will come in and be able to do that. Ultimately, he does talk a good game. That we've had various J-League and A-League experts on our show to talk to us about his results, his style of play, his philosophy. And I think the more we hear from them, the more reassured I feel about it. And the more positive I do feel about Postecoglou going into next season. I think it's a risk, of course it is, but I think it's quite an exciting one. I think that if this goes well, then Celtic will get all the plaudits for tapping into a relatively unknown market and it working out. Obviously, if it goes the other way, then there will be plenty of people saying, I told you so. But for me, I think we've got to remain optimistic, and I certainly hope it is the former.
Oh, Natasha's froze again.
But ultimately, he's going to get judged on results, isn't he? So these games that we've seen starting the season it isn't an easy first 5 games, and we need him to come and hit the ground running and he will get judged on those results.
What we need is free scoring, never boring. Roaring Glasgow Celtic, as Tony Haggett would say. Win the first 5 games, 15 points. Everybody would be on the Ange bus, wouldn't they? It's would go a long way, wouldn't it, if he wins his first 5 games to buy in some time. It's listen, the players will be getting through the paces, up to speed fitness wise. Hopefully Ange's doing his video analysis in the background. He must have a list of targets he wants to bring in. Surely that was part of the interview process, saying, well, look, if I'm coming, I've looked through your squad, I know who's leaving, who's likely to be sold, who's not, I know what your weaknesses are. Who's your targets? Who have you got? Who have you scouted? Because here's my ideas, here's who I want to bring in. And hopefully we see that starting to happen pretty soon. And we don't leave it to after Euro qualifiers, as Celtic like to do.
There's always a gamble, isn't it, going into these Euro qualifiers? And every season we do say the same thing, that we see us starting with Beaton at centre half, and it looks no different. I mean, at the moment, we are really in the position where we could line up for our first Champions League qualifiers with a back 4 of Ralston and Welsh and Beaton and Taylor. And every season we say we can't afford to let that happen again. We have to recruit before these Champions League qualifiers, and every season we don't. And it looks like this season is going to be no different. In terms of Postecoglou, I am with you, Lawrence. I certainly hope that he has targets in mind, and what I hope is that he gets the backing and the resources just to go out and get those targets. We can't afford any time in terms of stalling and negotiation and long drawn out processes when we really need to just identify who Ange wants and goes and gets them. What we're hearing at the moment is, obviously, like we've touched on earlier, is the Australian connections. So we're hearing Martin Boyle, we're hearing Matt Ryan, we're hearing Aaron Moy, and to be honest, that could work. If it's players that Ange knows, then that could, work. It could sort of simplify the bedding in process if they already know the manager, they know his style. And these players being mentioned in terms of Moy and Matt Ryan, and they're players that could improve our squad. They're good targets to go and get. So I'm quite excited to see who he brings in. And I'm even more interested to see what he does in terms of a backroom team. We still don't know what's happening with Kennedy and Strachan. What we do know is that Ange's assistants at Yokohama are still there. His coaches who were with him during this period there are staying there. They're still employed by the club. So it looks like he's not bringing those coaches with him. And what we've heard is that he does like to start with, fresh management teams when he moves. So it'll be interesting. Are we going to see him getting a say in who he brings in? Is it going to be Kennedy and Strachan? Is Kennedy perhaps considering his options to go to management elsewhere? I know there's a lot of division about whether Kennedy and Strachan should be retained, given, they were heavily involved in the disaster of last season. And as much as, Neil Lennon took the fall for it, these guys were on the training ground every single day as well and have to have some sense of culpability as well. So for a lot of people, I understand that they don't want Kennedy and Strachan anywhere near this team. What about you, Brian? What do you think the future sees for Kennedy and Strachan, and is there some role for them at Celtic?
Well, the interesting thing about Kennedy and Strachan, I've been chatting about this before, but I think one of the things, just to touch on, you spoke about was the Champions League qualifiers coming up and the amount of the time to get players in. Imagine it also has to get recruit and interview a backroom staff. I just don't think there's time to do it. And I think that although Kennedy gets criticised for last year and being part of that debacle, and as much as I think he should have left with Gavin Strachan, I don't think that the time's right. I think it's actually better he stays just now and Postecoglou comes in, because again, anything I've seen from Postecoglou, and you touched on it, Natasha, he seems to like to come in with the current staff and then basically assess them on the job and decide over the period of a few months who's naughty and who's nice, and he sort of sends them on their way or keeps them. And I think, given that the players all refer to Kennedy as Kendo and they seem to like him, I don't think it's the worst position for him to be in, coming in. Actually, what I think might be worse is if he comes in and Kennedy and Strachan take pre-season training, Postecoglou comes in and then Kennedy leaves. That actually may throw up more problems. I think a decision either way. If they're going to be his backroom staff, say it, let's get started, and then it's not going to be forever. If they're not, similarly, they need to go just now, and he just has to start. Get Tommy McIntyre and Steve McManus to take the team. Give him a shot. Get Fran Alonso on to help him as an assistant for a couple of weeks until he recruits. There's plenty of routes he can go, but he has to make a decision, or the club, whoever's making the decisions, has to make them quickly.
Listen, Fran Alonso's got a Champions League to prepare his team for. You know, hopefully under the disco lights we'll get to see the girls in the Champions League. But I think you're right, Kennedy and Strachan have got to stay. We need some continuity just now, and as long as Ange's got the decision, he gets to look at them and decide, you know what, I can work with them or I can't. The weird thing on the Kennedy one, you touched on the players calling him Kendall, but Lenny came out and complained, I didn't get to pick my own backroom staff. But in the same interview he went, oh, but Kennedy was very, very good. You're going, well, what, you're complaining about a guy that's very, very good? Why would you complain about a guy that's very, very good? So it's strange, you know, and Rodgers has praised him as well. So whatever worked or didn't work between those three last year doesn't mean that they couldn't work with Ange. Certainly Kennedy worked as part of the Rodgers backroom staff. Maybe that more kind of professional setup suited him. And maybe Ange will bring that.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be an interesting one. One thing that keeps coming up about Kennedy is, could he fulfil the role we saw Brown? Was Brown going to have the impact on the squad and in the team that he has had during his career at Celtic? No, his playing time certainly would have been limited. But the majority of people I've spoken to, and me myself, think that what Brown could have brought to us next season was that sort of steadying presence through a very difficult rebuild. We know, we've discussed so much, the scale of this rebuild is massive, and that we need some sort of steadying presence in and around the club to just sort of navigate that rebuild. And Brown seemed to be the person that everyone looked to and said, yes, that is a role for Scott Brown. He can help the new players come in and settle. He can teach them about the club. He knows the club inside out. So if we're saying all this about Scott Brown, then why are we saying it about John Kennedy? Could John Kennedy fulfil that role? Do we need some sort of stabling presence, someone who has been around the club for as long as John Kennedy has, to try and help us through this rebuild? And for me, that potentially is a role that Kennedy could fulfill. And couple that with the fact that he is apparently a very good coach. For me, his 10 games in charge was a bit of a failed addition. I've said that before. I really expected more from him over those 10 games he took. I don't think that he did himself any favours. I would have liked to have seen him be innovative. I would have liked to have seen him try something different, bring some youth players through. And he unfortunately didn't do any of that in his last 10 games, which is a big disappointment for me with Kennedy. But if he is this amazing coach that we hear from people like Brendan Rodgers and Scott Brown and Neil Lennon, if he is this good, then maybe it would be a mistake to let Kennedy go at this time. Yeah,
definitely. It gives us some continuity, doesn't it? Which we're going to need. And if Ange decides by Christmas he can't work with him, and it's bye-bye, well, thanks for all your help, John. But if he can work with Ange and produces results for him, that would be the ideal scenario for everyone, wouldn't it? You wouldn't be, if you had a coach that was really good and could work with a new manager, why would you want to step outside? So hopefully it works. Maybe his last, I was disappointed with his 10 games in charge as well, but part of that was limited with the squad, didn't it? Very few fit wingers. Right back, the team was lacking width. It was the same problems, I suppose, Lenny faced and Celtic faced for most of the season. He should maybe have been more adventurous, played Sorrow more and dropped Brown. But then again, he's seeing Sorrow in training. Maybe he's gone, the boy's not got it. I think in glimpses, Sorrow's shown he could be the guy, but we've not really seen enough of him. And a lot of those last 10 games, they were just dead rubber games. Surely that was the time for him, or whoever was picking the team, to experiment and go, well, give these guys some game time. Let's see what they've got, because they're going to be here next season. An extra 3 or 4 games for Sorrell would kind of know whether he was going to be good enough then, or whether he was going to need replaced, or what, so that was disappointing that he wasn't more adventurous, but maybe he just felt he was really limited by the squad, and that was the best that could get put out.
I think that's something we've got to remember, is that he does see them on the training ground every day. We say that we wanted to see more of players like the French players and Sorrell. We wanted to see Karamoko Dembele and Okoflex. We wanted to see them for the last 10 games. What Kennedy and Strachan could turn around and say is that they've seen them every single day. They watch them in training every single day. So even though we're not seeing them, and as a fan you're not getting to assess these fringe players, these guys are seeing them every single day, and we've got to remember that. Of course, matches are different. Watching the matches play in a competitive football game is different. But like you've touched on, that is something that they see in training every day. Brian, what's your thoughts on John Kennedy? Where do you see his role next year?
Well, the interesting thing about Kennedy, so just in the interest of balance, we keep hearing people talk about how he's a good coach, a great coach. To be fair, I've rarely heard an interview where someone's come out and been asked about a player or another manager or another coach. Nobody's ever said, the big man's absolutely honking, you're going to have a nightmare, he's rubbish. They're always kind of complimentary. If a player's asked about his old manager, generally says, yeah, he was a really good coach, or yeah, he was a really good player. So I think some of the comments about Kennedy you have to take with a pinch of salt. I know Brendan tried to take him away, so he obviously is decent, but I don't get too excited when I hear players saying, he's a great coach. Because A, they're not going to say anything bad about him, and B, just because you like your manager or your coach doesn't make them good. I've had bosses I've worked for, or trainers I've worked for, that I couldn't stand, but they've been really, really good. Similarly, I've been ones I've really liked, but they've done nothing for my career. So, is it complacency? Is it familiarity? There's these things to consider as well with Big Kennedy. So that's just a negative take for balance, in case anybody accuses us of being the John Kennedy fan club all of a sudden. In a positive way, I think when you talk about why couldn't Brown do this role, I think simply because they thought Eddie Howe was coming in with his own backroom staff, and Brown was probably told, you're not going to be part of the backroom staff. If they'd waited a couple of weeks, he probably would have been. He probably would have been someone that Postecoglou could have lent on. But that's a sliding doors moment we're not going to know. As I say, I don't think whether Kennedy's a great coach, a good coach, or an average coach, what he's not going to be is a bad coach. He's not going to be a debilitating influence on the squad. Having him there, worst case, Postecoglou doesn't like how he operates, he'll let him go. That's it. So I don't think it's going to derail the season if Gavin Strachan's sitting, playing Candy Crush on his laptop at half time. I think Postecoglou will move them on if that's the case. If it's the case that his laptop's really useful when he's doing those analytics that Postecoglou likes, then brilliant, he'll stay. I think at this stage, and as much as I'm furious about the way Celtic have operated last season and the way they went about their business and the way that the position we're in, the reality is we're in the position we're in, and Postecoglou's going to come in, and I think it's going to go well. And we kind of just have to, take what we're fed at the moment and see how it goes. If in a few months, as Lawrence touched on earlier, he's won his first 5 games, team's playing good football, we've seen a couple of decent players, brilliant, happy days, all that worry's been for nothing. If it's the case that he loses his first 5 games, then we can pat ourselves in the back and say, we told you so. But at the moment, it's all conjecture, and I don't think we can make any snap judgments either way.
No, I quite agree with you, Brian. And like we've already said, he will ultimately be judged on results. What I hope is that in the coming days and weeks that Celtic do give us a bit more information about the backroom team and what that's going to look like, because that's going to be vitally important. And something that we've said many times is that we need to get people in around Postecoglou that you can work with. It just works better when you've got people around you can work with. If that is Kennedy and Strachan, if Postecoglou wants them, then great, then they stay, because that's what Postecoglou wants. But who knows, it will be interesting to see. Before we finish, obviously the next game that we will see some of the Celtic squads taking part in is Scotland v England, coming up on Friday. Lawrence, how many of the Celtic's 6 squad players that we have, how many do you expect to see starting against England, and how do you see that game going?
I think, after losing this game, you're going to need 4 points. I think Clark is going to be defensive. I'd love to see Jamesy Forrest start. I'd love to see Turnbull start, but I don't think we're going to see too much of a difference. Was it 19 shots on target, no goals? Maybe Clark's going to go, well, you know what? That was a cracking header for the boy, up between the two centre halves. It really was, wasn't it? And people are talking goal of the tournament. I don't know. It's, blaming Marshall Bay off his line. It's not often you're going to see a goal scored for here. So maybe he's going, listen, a wee bit more luck. If Dykes had taken his chances, we could have got a better result. So maybe Clark's going, well, if I get 19 shots against England, I'm going to be happy. So I don't think he'll change too much. He seems fairly set in his systems, Clark, and his teams I've watched. And I don't actually think he'll change anything for the starting lineup. I think he's just going to go same again, unless Tierney's fit. And then if Tierney's fit, he'll bring in Kieran, the confused Kieran.
I'll put you both on the spot for a prediction then before we finish up. Brian, I'll come to you first. What's your prediction?
1 each.
Lawrence?
I'm going to go 1-0.
2.
1-0 Scotland?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think James Forrest is going to come off the bench and show what a talented player he is.
I certainly hope so. I'll go 2-1 Scotland, and we'll catch up back here next Tuesday to see which one of us is right. But in the meantime,
do you want another prediction?
Yeah, go for it.
Celtic will again fail to communicate what's happening with backroom staff. They'll fail to communicate what's happening with the director of football, and we'll all be left wondering actually what's going on at Celtic this time next week.
I think you could be right on that one, Lawrence. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us on A Celtic State of Mind with me, Natasha Meikle, Lawrence Connolly and Brian Zegning.